So let's start at the beginning. You were educated at one of the most prestigious schools in the world, Harrow.
Yep.
What's it like? What's it like to go to a school like that?
It's a long, long time ago. I was very, very fortunate to go there. My father worked incredibly hard to send me and my brothers there. I remember the first day with a very big degree of trepidation. At that time, I like to think I was a person of fairly average ability, and it did enable me, I think, to realise my full potential. And I think, looking back, I was very, very fortunate to be given that start in life, and I'm very conscious there are a lot of people who don't have that opportunity.
That's really interesting that you would have self-defined as somebody of average ability, but because of the nature of your school, you felt that that was what enabled you to fulfil your true potential.
Yes, and I think, when I look, I represent a constituency which is a coastal community, predominantly the town of Lowestoft, which has its challenges over the last 40 years, and there are an awful lot of people there who don't have those opportunities. And part of my work, I feel, is to give them those opportunities so people can realise their full potential. And I like to think over the last few years, yes, certain advances have been made, but there are still a lot of obstacles placed in the way of a lot of young people, which prevents them sort of really realising their full potential and realising those ambitions and dreams.
Is going to a school like Harrow, is that a help or a hindrance in politics?
Sometimes you think it may be a hindrance because some people may say, well, do we really want to be full of a lot of public schoolboys? Other times it can be an advantage. If I'm really frank, if I look at the opportunities I've had in life, it got me, actually, to be frank, probably got me my first job as a surveyor. Thereafter, if I was no good, I would have been out of that door pretty quickly. I'm not saying I was brilliant as a surveyor, but I think it opens doors, but those doors close pretty quickly and you're booted out if you don't come up to standard.
I suppose the argument is that the doors may never be open to
Correct.
some people.
That is very true.
When did you realise you were a Conservative?
I think it probably crept up on me, probably really in the very, very early 1970s. And if I remember my first recollection of politics, it was listening on a rather scratchy transistor radio, and it would have been, May 1970, when, very much against the odds, Ted Heath had won the general election. And I think that point in time, I felt, for whatever reason, I felt great. This is my party, and they've won against the odds.
So you've always voted Conservative, by the sounds of it?
I have always voted Conservative. I don't think, I don't think there's ever been a time when I've gone into that polling booth and said, come on, I'm not sure our Conservative candidate is particularly good, but I do like personally that Lib Dem or that Labour candidate. That's never actually happened. I could see a possibility where it could happen sometime in the future, and probably as you get into politics, I found as I've had the privilege of working in Westminster over the last 12 years, the tribes are still there, but actually you very quickly learn that there are people in those other tribes with whom you have an awful lot in common, who are actually good guys, and actually you do work with them on common projects. And very often you start off thinking, and a good example at the moment is NHS dentistry. You start off thinking, this is a problem unique to my area. We're being unfairly discriminated against. Then when you talk, you suddenly find there are colleagues all around the country from all different parties who have a similar problem. So you then work with them to try to find a solution.
When did you decide that you wanted to be a Member of Parliament?
I think it was probably in the late 1990s, probably after the 1997 election.
So you weren't swung by Blair mania?
Well, and actually, you'd probably also say I wasn't swung by Thatcherism either. I can remember I was working as a surveyor in the 1990s. I can remember the period distinctly. The Conservatives lost the general election in Black Monday in 1992, and it was an awful, very long, sustained car crash leading up to 1997. I remember that day vividly. I voted very early because I then had to go from East Anglia to actually go to a place called East Malling in Kent to look at some papers which had been left aside for me as part of my job. And I can remember it vividly. One felt, come on, this party's not doing very well. It's something I've always had a broad interest in. I'll probably get that stage getting to my late 30s, and I thought, well, unless you do something about it now, you will never have the opportunity to realise that ambition.
Very interesting. Because just reading about you're not afraid to speak out when you think your party has got it wrong. You seem especially concerned about the poorest in society. You believe that what was a temporary universal credit uplift should have been made permanent. Yep. Do you ever feel like you're in the wrong party?
No, I think the Conservative Party has always been a very, very broad church party, and it's important that it remembers that and retains it. It's also been a pragmatic party as well, and again, we need to have that in mind. And there have been great social reformers in the Conservative Party, whether that was the late Ian MacLeod, and also from my most illustrious predecessor in my constituency was Jim Pryor, who was MP from 1958 to 1987, and Jim was he was described as a wet. I think some people may say that's a sort of being rude to him. I would say in some ways today, probably being a wet Tory is a badge to wear with honour. And it's one nation conservatism, which I think does perhaps at times a term that gets bandied around a little too often and without really thinking what it's through, is about bringing the whole country with you. And as we were saying earlier, giving everyone that opportunity to realise their potential. It's good for them, good for them personally, it's good for society, it's also very good for the country in raw economic terms from our productivity.
So you describe yourself in the one nation tradition. Is the current Conservative government in that tradition, or are you a bit of an oddity in today's Conservative Party?
I hope it is in that tradition, and I think it's important that it is. It remains in that tradition. I think it is corny, but I think on the whole, elections are won from the centre ground, and I think it is important that you don't just appeal to people who are very strong core voters, but you actually reach out across that divide, and probably also bring in people from the centre who may not traditionally have thought about voting Conservatives. So I think there is a sense of, and I think it's something that we as a party must remember, that if we look back at what's happened in the last with COVID in particular, I have a view that actually what has happened with COVID, and now exacerbated by the awful events in the Ukraine, is probably a 1 in 100 year event, which quite frankly it's equivalent to the 1930s depression and crash, and the tools and the means of addressing these problems that we've used in the last 30 or 40 years, they may not necessarily work. And actually, we do have a responsibility, and I'm hearing some pretty awful stories of people who can't afford to sort of boil themselves a cup of coffee. And some people will tell me, with the way that electricity costs are going, that it's cheaper to go to Wetherspoons to get a cup of coffee. I heard this morning that people taking their family heirlooms to pawnbrokers to be able, not just to get a couple of £100 to be able to live on for the next few years or next few weeks. And that's from the Conservative point of view. It's not right that we should be a government when that happens, and we do need to address that problem.
You called for the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to resign during the Partygate affair. Some of your colleagues did the same but have withdrawn. It is reported that they have withdrawn those letters. Have you?
I haven't, no. I fought long and hard back in late January, early February as to whether I should do that, and I weighed up all manner of considerations, and I concluded then that it would be best for the country and, dare I say it, for the Conservative Party as well, if he did. And I've revisited that decision over the last few months, and I've decided that really those reasons are still there. Now, I fully respect there are colleagues who have not reached that same decision, and that is up to them to one way or another. But if I look what's happened since then, well, we've had the Prime Minister has been fined. We've had a situation where he's been referred to the Parliamentary Privileges Committee as to whether he knowingly misled Parliament or not. And I think we've got to wait to see what happens. But that event in itself is not something that happens very often. I think it's happened 3 previous times since the war, and then never to a Prime Minister. So it's completely unprecedented. One of the things that have changed since then are that obviously there has been the Ukraine war, which was talked about at that time, has actually happened. And it looks at the moment as if it's not going to be like the Kuwait war, that it's going to go on for some considerable time. The problems in Northern Ireland have very much focus has come on those, and they've come very much into the spotlight. And also, obviously, the cost of living challenge. So we've got these enormous challenges there. Some people would say that actually now is not the right time for a change. The other side of the argument is that it will continue to be a distraction. And I think what I also find when I go back and listen to people in my constituency, it really has split people. Some people say, this is, what are we worrying about with these problems? We shouldn't be worrying about parties. Get on with it. Other people, and you hear some heart-rending stories of people who weren't able to see their loved ones when they were sadly passing on, and they will never get over it. And I sense they will never forgive. And so we are it's a very, very difficult circumstances. We obviously also, you've got to look at the court of public opinion. We had council elections earlier this month where, whichever way you look at it, they weren't very good for the Conservative Party. And so, without any ill feeling or malice, yes, I still hold my views, and my letter still remains with Sir Graham Brady.
Really interesting to chat to you. We never chatted as colleagues. I wish we had have done now.
Yes.
Thank you for your time, Peter.
No,
Aldous.
thanks very much indeed, Gloria. That's kind.
Thank you.